The 19th century in Italy was the era of Risorgimento. The country had previously been broken up into little city-states, individual countries really, that had an ancient history of border conflict and war. This history was built on layers of distrust fueled by the doctrine of the divine right of each of the rulers of those small city-states to continually perpetuate their royal status. All of this began to fall apart under the Italian people's desire for a unified country, under an enlightened democratic head of state with a Congress or a parliament standing guard over the rights of the people. This was Risorgimento, and all artists, musicians, poets, and composers of conscience participated in the nationalistic fervor. It was in the midst of this political turmoil played out on the battlefield by the great Garibaldi that the Italian composer Giuseppe Verdi received a commission from the Paris Opera to write a piece that in many ways historically paralleled much of what was going on in Italy at the time. To be offered an opportunity to write an opera for the major European opera house, dealing with themes that were still resonating in the lives of his contemporaries, was an offer that the composer couldn't refuse. The opera, Verdi's great sprawling epic, Don Carlo. I'm Nick Reveles, and this is OperaTalk. In order to understand Don Carlo, we have to go back to 16th century Spain, and the location here at Mission San Diego de Alcalá will help us do that. But we also have to do that through the eyes of the 19th century German Romantic poet and playwright, Friedrich Schiller. Schiller was fascinated by history and often looked to history for inspiration in the writing of his plays. In his play Don Carlos, he found the opportunity to deal with personal and political conflict during the reign of Philip II of Spain. The premise of his play was firmly encapsulated in Schiller's belief that liberalism and absolutism could not coexist, and that ultimately there could be no compromise between them. The political background for the story was the struggle of Spanish-ruled Protestant states in the Netherlands for independence from Philip. But the personal conflict, although completely fictional, is far more interesting. In the play, Philip sends his son, the Infante Don Carlo, to France to meet whom he assumes to be his intended bride, Elizabeth of Valois. As soon as he sees her, he falls in love. But word soon comes through a messenger from Spain that Elizabeth is intended not for poor Carlo, the heir to the throne, but for his father, King Philip. With his beloved Elizabeth suddenly destined to become his stepmother, Carlo's destiny and life with the family at the Escorial looks very dismal indeed. Throw into the mix the Marquis of Posa, Carlo's best friend and a champion of the Flemish cause, and Princess Eboli, both a mistress of Philip's and a meddler of the highest degree, and you have a drama of great proportions. Things really begin to heat up when Carlo takes sides with the Flemish against his father, the king, and the Grand Inquisitor, a cardinal of the church, pressures the king to see Carlo's actions as both sinful and treasonous. And so we have a drama that plays at multiple levels: personal, political, and spiritual. Now, little of this is true, and Schiller knew it. The real Don Carlo was one of those pitiful victims of too much royal intermarriage. He was evidently hunchbacked, crippled, and mentally incapacitated. He was known to fly into violent, uncontrollable fits of rage and was often confined due to illness. We'll talk a little bit more about the real Don Carlo later. It's been rumored that he was poisoned by his exasperated father, but we really don't know that for sure. It is a fact that Carlo sided with the Protestant Netherlands against his father, and that his stepmother Elizabeth was very fond of him. But was he in love with her? Did he carry on some kind of affair with her? Most probably not. And although he was fond of conspiracies in an attempt to further his ambitions as heir to the throne, he was completely inept politically and probably couldn't have told a Flemish Protestant from a box of hair. But there was enough potential for dramatic conflict in the story for Schiller to have written a lengthy play, with Spain and the court of Philip used as a colorful background for an exploration of themes that were quite current during the playwright's lifetime. This was, after all, the age of revolution. Absolute monarchies like Philip's were toppling right and left, and the church, which took its temporal power from centuries of support from these autocratic regimes, was suddenly threatened with the dismantling of that power. Church and state relations were under siege, and things were about to change dramatically. Against all this historical background, it's easy to see how the Paris Opera's approach to Verdi in 1865 to write an opera based on Don Carlo by Friedrich Schiller was of great interest to him. Verdi was, after all, at the center of the Risorgimento movement. He believed in the freedom of the individual, in the one Italy and the parliamentary system, as well as the complete separation of church and state. He began work on the music early in 1866. Then in the summer of that year traveled to Paris to begin what was to become an extraordinarily long rehearsal process, leading finally to the premiere in March 1867. Parisian tastes demanded certain elements when producing opera at the Garnier Opera House. Among them was an attraction to opera at its grandest level, large choruses, epic stories, and the ubiquitous ballet, a part of French opera from the very beginnings. Verdi incorporated all of these elements in this first French version of Don Carlo, making it the lengthiest opera that he'd written to date. Constant revision was necessary, and it made for an overall unpleasant experience for the composer. This revision process made it difficult for Verdi to fill out some of the characters in the drama, and critics often point to the rather sketchy characterization of Carlo himself and Elizabeth, the Queen. But the king, Philip II, is a wonderfully rich character, and of great interest is the role of the Marquis of Posa, Rodrigo, Don Carlo's best friend and the champion of the Flemish Protestant cause. This is an entirely fictional character, but he captured Verdi's imagination, and the composer characterized him through the vocal color of the baritone. Verdi loved the electric, dynamic quality of the baritone voice, and it was perfect for Posa, whose actions in the drama can be seen at one point as heroic, at another self-serving, at another somewhat evil, but ultimately sacrificial. He is one of the great Verdi characters. Reaction to the premiere of the five-act French Don Carlo in 1867 was mixed, and although it had 44 performances that season, it was dropped from the opera's repertoire and not revived until well into the 20th century. Dissatisfied with the opera's obscurity, as well as the Italian revivals that began to be produced in translation, the composer returned to the opera in 1882, revising it and preparing a four-act version, which eventually premiered at La Scala in 1884. This revision benefits from touches of the master's mature style, and it is this four-act Italian version that is most often produced these days. Don Carlo is writ large on an epic, darkly colored canvas. It was controversial, however, enough that the very Catholic Empress Eugénie of France, who was in the audience at the premiere, turned her back to the stage during the portrayal of the Grand Inquisitor. She was offended by the presentation of a church leader as something of a villain. The opera's reputation as anti-Catholic followed it to the Metropolitan Opera in New York, when Rudolph Bing produced it as part of his first season there as general director in 1950. Traditionalist Catholics appeared outside the theater to picket the production and denounce its themes. Isn't it interesting that even in our own time, opera has the power to engage, inflame, and provoke audiences to action? In Act 1 of Don Carlo, we find Carlo in the tomb of his grandfather Charles V at the monastery of San Juste. Carlo laments his now lost love of Elizabeth of Valois, who has married his father, the king, and he confesses his feelings to Rodrigo, his best friend. Rodrigo, known as the Marquis of Posa, beseeches the Infante to help save the downtrodden Protestant people of Flanders. The two men swear friendship and devotion to the cause of liberty. The next scene finds us in the court of the Queen, Elizabeth. The court entertains itself with a song from the Princess Eboli, who, unbeknownst to the Queen, is not only the king's mistress, but also loves Carlo. Posa enters with a letter to the Queen from Don Carlo, and then distracts Eboli with gossips so that she won't notice. Posa begs the Queen to grant Carlo an interview, and as he leads Eboli and the others away, Carlo enters. A duet ensues, during which he ultimately professes his love for her, but she sternly warns him, reminding him that she is now his mother. Carlo rushes off in despair. The king enters, and all retire except the king and Posa, who frankly denounces the king for his cruelty to the people of Flanders. Instead of being insulted, the king thanks him for his honesty, but warns him to beware of the Grand Inquisitor. At the same time, he asks Posa to keep an eye on the queen and his son. He suspects something. In Act 2, Carlo is tricked into a midnight meeting with the queen, but the message really has come from Princess Eboli. When the princess arrives, her suspicions are proved true. Carlo loves only Elizabeth. After Posa enters, she leaves in a fury. Posa asks Carlo to confide in him, as well as to give him any incriminating letters dealing with the problem in Flanders. In the next scene, we are in the square before the Church of Our Lady of Atocha. A bonfire of heretics, an auto da fe, is about to commence. But when a group from Flanders arrives, the king is astonished to see his son, Don Carlo, at the head of their procession, pleading on the behalf of these Protestants. The king demands their arrest, and Carlo draws his sword against his father. Amazingly, it is his best friend, Posa, who steps in and asks Carlo to give up his sword. Act 3 finds us in the king's study, where he broods about his queen's seeming disaffection and his son's rebelliousness. The Grand Inquisitor, an old, blind cardinal, enters. A duet begins in which the clergyman insists that the Infante, who is filled with many dangerous ideas, be handed over to the Inquisition. At first the king refuses, but eventually he agrees. Elizabeth enters with Eboli, and the king presents the queen with evidence of her love for Carlo. A locket with his likeness has been found in her jewelry box. The king accuses her of adultery and leaves. When they are alone, Princess Eboli confesses that it was she who accused the queen with the evidence, and she further confesses she is the king's mistress. Furthermore, she did all this because she loved Carlo and he rejected her. The queen gives her the choice of entering a convent or going into exile and leaves Eboli alone. In a stunning aria, Eboli swears that during the last day of freedom, she will save Carlo. The first scene of the final act finds Carlo imprisoned for heresy and treason. Posa comes to visit with him and informs the Infante that he has been found with the incriminating letters and he will surely soon be killed. He says that he will go to the king and confess his role in the Flanders situation and asks Carlo to go to Flanders to save the Protestants in his stead. Suddenly, an assassin who is hiding secretly in the shadows of the prison shoots Posa. With his dying breath, he begs his friend to continue struggling for the Flemish cause. With his best friend dead, imprisoned by the Inquisition, and reviled by his father the king, what will Carlo do? How will this opera end? Sorry, you'll have to see it, and you simply won't believe the ending. In order to explore a little bit more of the Spanish background of Verdi's opera Don Carlo, I wanted to invite my good friend, the professor of history at the University of San Diego, Iris Engstrand, to join us and talk about Don Carlos of Spain. Iris, welcome to OperaTalk.
Well, thank you for having me, because I am anxious to clear up a few misconceptions about Don Carlo versus the real Don Carlos, and a little bit about the history of Spain.
Well, tell us about Carlos himself. I mean, I said a little bit earlier in the program, but exactly what was the nature of this character?
Well, Carlos was actually an unfortunate person in the fact that he was a product of too much intermarriage and close connections, and he was born with some defects. It's described variously as deformities, and his personality, you might say, left quite a bit to be desired. He was a difficult child. He was kind of sad when you read that he was cruel to animals, and just generally a person that was a little bit hard to deal with, although Philip did try very hard to include him in diplomatic circles, but each time he would sort of become embarrassed about Carlos's behavior.
So the basic relationship between father and son probably started out well, but deteriorated as Carlos grew up?
I think so, although Philip generally did the best he could, and of course Carlos was shuffled off to different caretakers and people who would raise him. And probably the most famous incident, I think, for San Diego is the fact that he eventually does attend the University of Alcalá at age 17. And while he's there, he is sneaking out of his quarters one night to visit a servant girl and fell down the stairs, cracks his skull, and goes into a coma. So you can imagine if you were the university administrator thinking, oh my heavens, I have the son
the heir
of
to the throne, yeah.
The king of Spain is in a coma. And so for a couple of days they tried things and nothing seemed to work. And so at last they had to tell Philip. And so Philip had his private physician, Dr. Vesalius, who was quite well known, came, diagnosed a concussion, but nobody seemed to know what to do. So they hired a Morisco, who normally Philip would have had nothing to do with, but he had a reputation of curing people, so they put some black balm on his head and a white balm, still nothing. Some Franciscans who were nearby said, well, you know, we have the cure, the miraculous cure of our dear departed brother Diego. He did die 100 years ago, but his cadaver seems to do the trick. So they said, all right, bring it on. So they bring the body of Don Diego in, and
who was mummified.
Mummified by this time, obviously. Yeah. He's a little old here in death. And so they put him at the end of the bed, and apparently in the morning, Carlos awakens and had a vision that he was visited by a Franciscan and now wakes up.
Oh my God.
And so the story goes that Philip is totally excited, and Carlos is cured, although actually after this time he still had difficulty walking and difficulty, say his limited faculties probably became more limited.
Right.
But Philip then starts the movement to canonize Diego because of this miracle. And
so that's where San Diego eventually comes from.
Right, because they were at Alcalá, and so by 1588, coincidentally with the defeat of the Spanish armadas, like the good news and the bad news. The good news was Diego was canonized and immediately became very popular as San Diego de Alcalá, and therefore ships were named for him, forts. In fact, Vizcaíno's ship, San Diego, Vizcaíno arrives in our port of San Diego on November 12th, the day of San Diego, and so that's how we got our name for the city and for the University of San Diego de Alcalá.
Now, just a little bit about Philip. Part of the political background is that Philip was the ruler of parts of the Netherlands at the time that were Protestant. And there was a real tussle here, wasn't there, politically? I mean, I don't assume that the Dutch liked Philip very much.
Yeah, I think that's putting it mildly about the tussle. And it all stems from Charles V, who was the son of Juana, the daughter of Isabel, Ferdinand and Isabella, who were, of course, the major rulers of the 15th century. And Charles was born in Flanders, so he was actually Flemish, born in Ghent. And so he had a lot of ties with the Netherlands. And when he came to Spain as Charles I, he barely spoke Spanish, he still spoke Flemish. And so upon his death, Philip then inherits the Netherlands. But by this time, the Netherlands are partially Protestant. There's a deal of Protestantism in Brabant and some of the other areas. And of course, Protestantism had spread into France, and there was a lot of struggles, dynastic struggles. And so the people in the Netherlands never liked the Spanish to begin with, didn't want to be Catholic in the second place. So there's constant struggle. Although there is a little group of Catholics that still support Charles and then Philip. And so part of the problem of Don Carlos even is he wants to go and be the representative of Spain in the Netherlands, for which he's barely qualified.
Yeah, and we know that didn't work out at all.
No.
Iris, thanks so much for filling us in on the Spanish background of Don Carlo.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Nick.
Okay. This is probably the most famous tune from Verdi's Don Carlo. It's from the friendship duet between Don Carlo and his friend, the Marquis of Posa, in Act 1. This tune recurs a number of times during the opera to signify their dedication to each other. The opera is full of great melodies like this, and there are even moments of real Spanish flavor to match the story. Listen to the bolero-like rhythm under Princess Eboli's Veil song, with which she entertains the court. One of the glories of the score is the tinta, or color, of the score. It's very dark, and there seems to be an emphasis on passages written for the lower wind and brass instruments, which gives the whole opera the atmosphere of a Baroque Spanish painting, something by Zurbarán, Velázquez, or Murillo. This color is essential to telling of the story, of course, and I can think of no better example than Verdi's musical evocation of both the opening and closing scenes of the opera, which take place in the crypt of the monastery of San Yuste. After an orchestral introduction featuring those burnished sounds of the lower brass, the male chorus enters, as if chanting a prayer from deep within the walls of the monastery. This sets the tone for the whole political and ecclesiastical intrigue that surrounds the character of Carlo, whom we first meet in this obscure, even frightening place. But by the final scene of the opera, the intrigue has taken a deadly turn. Carlo's best friend, the Marquis, is dead. Suspicion has been cast upon his beloved Elizabeth, and the Grand Inquisitor has asked the king for Carlo's imprisonment. We're back in the monastery of San Yuste, and the curtain goes up to reveal Elizabeth, who has come to say farewell to Carlo. The very same chanting of the male chorus is repeated here, except in a higher key. And there's another even more striking difference, the addition of a soaring theme in the strings that deepens the emotional content of the scene. With the juxtaposition of these two themes, one familiar to us from an earlier part of the opera and a new one that prepares us for the tragic ending, we see a true musical and theatrical master at work. There are all sorts of resources available for you to get to know Don Carlo better. Because there are so many different versions, you have to be careful what you choose. But here are two wonderful examples of recordings of Don Carlo that I think you'll enjoy. The first one is one that's been around for some time, conducted by Carlo Maria Giulini. This stars Placido Domingo, Montserrat Caballé, and Ruggiero Raimondi in the three major roles at the top of this opera. This recording is the 5-act Italian version, which is actually a translation. There's also a venerable recording of the 5-act original French version. Again, we have Placido Domingo in the title role, and in the role of Elizabeth, Katia Ricciarelli, and in the role of Philip, the King of Spain, again, Ruggiero Raimondi. All of these wonderful singers are under the baton of Claudio Abbado. There's also now a wonderful video out on DVD of the Met production of Don Carlo. Again, Placido Domingo in the title role, the wonderful Mirella Freni as Elizabeth, and in the role of King Philip of Spain, Nikolai Ghiarov. This is a terrific production, and I know you'll enjoy it. It's in Italian, also 5 acts. There is again, it seems I recommend this book to you every time we deal with Verdi, but this 3-volume work of the operas of Verdi by Julian Budden is exquisite. And if you really want to know the opera in depth, look at the chapter on Don Carlo. All of these resources are readily available to you, either to purchase at your local bookstores or CD stores, or to get online. Verdi's Don Carlo is a great masterwork that, while filled with purely fictional elements, is based on history and helps us to look at the history within which we live. There are still autocratic regimes in this world, after all, where dictators or religious leaders squelch political freedom and where civil liberties are violently suppressed. Great art teaches us about our own real world, and that's exactly the case with Don Carlo, a great opera. I'm Nick Reveles. I'll see you at the opera.